Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from AlexMercedCoder.dev. And in this video, what I want to do is do basically a masterclass on the front-end fetch API. So just kind of understanding like what is fetch, what are the abstractions around fetch, like the request and response object, just like a real deep dive into the fetch function. Not just have to do a simple API call, but really kind of understanding the bells and whistles. Okay, cool. Now, first off, we just need to start our server. I already have an Express server that kind of made here from the last couple videos I did about CSS loaders and whatnot. But a nice, neat trick that I recently saw, which blew my mind as we started the server, is I have node 19. So on node 19, and well, first thing that's like newer is if on node 19 I can do this -- watch flag. That's basically like nodemon. That's not the big thing I want to show you. But just so you know, if you are using node 19, you don't need nodemon because you can just add this watch flag when you run your backend servers when you're using node. But also there's this -inspect flag. And what this does, it's going to make it possible for you to see all your logs of your backend via the browser, which means you can take advantage of all sort of like the way the browser displays console logs and the debugger and all that stuff to do a lot of debugging. So I just want to show you that real quick. And then let's just run our server. So again, the watch flag is going to allow this to restart anytime I make changes to the code. And inspect is going to allow me to inspect the backend console logs through the browser, which is pretty neat. Okay, so you can see that's all turned on. See debugger's listening on this URL. We'll show you how to access that in a second. And just so you know, basically, my front end is just this index.html. So my Express server is statically serving this website folder. So essentially, this is my front end. So I'm going to open that with live server. Okay, so that's this website right here, which right now is still from our previous exercise, which we'll change up in a second. And actually what I'll do is I'll make a separate page. So we're going to create a new file, fetch.html. Okay, and then we'll just head over to fetch.html. Okay, so this is a blank page right now. But if I open up DevTools, you'll notice that there's this little like green node button here. If I click that, it opens up a new window. So you see this little window here with node. So now see the console log for my backends show up here. So I can see all the console logs going on in my front end here, and I can see all the console logs for my backend here. Okay, which makes it a lot nicer to kind of see like the way like objects and arrays console log and things like that. So that's pretty neat. Not really the subject of this video, but worth showing. Okay, so I'll put that up here to the side for now. So we're going to talk about fetch. So the idea behind the fetch API, which is a browser API, is to be able to make HTTP requests. So again, the idea is that generally the way different pieces of software communicate in the internet is by making HTTP requests. Once upon a time, when you were using JavaScript, for you to do an HTTP request to request stuff from another server, you would have to make like an XHR request object. This is how you'd have to do it. So let's just look up so you can see how that looks like. And this was not pleasant. Okay, so you'd have to like create, let's see if we can find an example code that shows you like the whole deal. Okay, not really much in the way of sample code here. Okay, so you can start seeing here. Okay, so essentially what you do is you would create like a new, this new XML HTTP request object, and basically you would have to like listen, basically do this open, and this would be like what sends the URL, and it wasn't as straightforward. It was a more event-based API because a lot of the old JavaScript APIs were more event-based because JavaScript was typically an event-based program. Luckily now we have promises, which make that all a lot simpler. So now you have fetch. Fetch makes things a lot simpler. Okay, and the way fetch works is let's just show you a quick example. Okay, so right now let's go to my backend code and make a quick route just to get some data. Okay, I want to get some JSON data, which we have the /API route for. Okay, that's going to get me data in 3 seconds. I'm going to get rid of that. Or actually, we'll just make a separate route. app.get /fetch rec res, and then this is using express.js. Okay, and we're going to say, hey, that whenever I make a request to this API route, it's going to respond with this object. Response hello. Okay, so that's the API. Okay, so let me go back to my front end code in the fetch.html. Okay, and we're going to say script, so we can write some JavaScript. And at the most basic level, okay, what you can do is I can say, hey, const response, we'll say, equals, actually, we'll just do it this way. We're going to say fetch, so we call the fetch function, and the fetch function can take a URL, okay? So I can pass it a URL, and I can say, hey, I want to make a request to that /fetch endpoint on my server. Notice I don't have to type out the whole URL. The reason I'm not typing out the whole URL is because it's all part of the same server. So it's still, whenever I type this /fetch, since it's on the same website, it's going to just assume that, hey, like this is the website, and it's just going to say website /API. Okay. Although, actually, technically, I don't want to do it that way. I'm going to go to localhost /4444/fetch.html. Okay, there we go. That's what I want to do. Okay, so what I'll do is it's going to make a request to localhost 444/API, and that's where my server is running. But if I were to making a request to another website, which we'll do an example of, I have to put the full URL. So always remember, if it's relative to the host that you're on, the URL that you're on, then I can just put in the end point. But if it's another origin, so another .com or another subdomain, then I need to put the full URL, including the HTTP or HTTPS. Keep that in mind. Okay, and if I do that, this fetches from the API, but that returns a promise. So then, actually, just to kind of demonstrate this, I would just say const response equals, and if I console log this, we're going to get you'll see I'm going to get this response object. Okay, actually I get a promise. So you'll see this is going to be a promise. So let's go over here so you can see it. So you get this promise object. And notice it says pending, because the idea is that the way a promise works is like this API call, we don't know how long it's going to take. So we promise that you will eventually have that data. Okay? So in order to actually use that data with a promise, we have to do response. We take that promise object and we use the .then function. And the .then function, what it does, it says, hey, when the thing finally arrives, whatever data this API call or this promise is supposed to give you, when it arrives, here's what you want to do with it. Okay, so we'll just say, so you create a function, okay, and then this you pass an argument here, and that argument is whatever you got back from the promise. So we're going to just say res for response. And then we're going to console.log that res object. Okay, so again, we'll just make this a little bit tidier. Response is this, and res is this. Put a comma there. So now if I go over here and I refresh this, so you see here the response was the promise, but then when we use that .then function, in the .then function we actually have access to the actual data from the API call. And notice that it's inside this special type of object called response. So this is one of the two types of objects that you get in fetch. So when fetch actually fetches you something, what it gives you back is not the data, the raw data itself. It gives you back this response object, okay? Because this response object has a lot of things you may want to use, okay? Basically, the actual data from your response is in this stream. You're not going to want to use that. You have this headers object if you want to grab any of the headers from the response. This OK function, this OK property, this is to use if you want to do like an if statement to see, hey, did this API call go fine? You can be like, if response.ok or if res.ok is true, then go forward. If not, then you like throw an error or give an error message saying like something went wrong. Okay. Basically, you have all these different pieces of information that you can use to better understand, hey, how did this response get handled? Okay. But also built into this is two functions. So if I go here to the prototype, see there's these functions that are built into the response object. The most important ones are going to be the text function and the JSON function. So if what you expect to get back from wherever you requested is JSON data, and again, we're sending JSON data. So again, if we go back to my backend, see I'm sending this response, hello, I'm sending back JSON data, then I can use the JSON function to parse that JSON. If it's some other type of text, or I just want the JSON as text, I can use this text function. Okay, and if it's like if you got back like a file blob, like like an image as a binary, you could use this blob function to turn it into a blob object. Okay, so you have a couple different options on how to take that data. Okay, and then you can see like if you want the data from the response to be in the form of form data, you got this form data function. So there's different ways that this response object can help you. I would say the vast majority of the time you're going to be using this JSON function. Okay, so what happens is that in here, then what I want is I'm going to say console.log, or actually we're going to say const JSON equals res.json. Okay, cool. And so now if I do that, let's take a look at what we get. Console.log JSON colon JSON. So let's examine. Okay, let's refresh again. And notice I get another promise. Okay, so when I use that JSON function also returns a promise. So that means that's not going to be usable right out of the box. Okay, I'm going to have to also do JSON.then. And then again, I write another function. And the result of that promise will be passed into here. So we'll just say, hey, this is the raw data that we got back from our API call. And if I console.log the data, let's see what that looks like. Okay, now if I refresh that, cool. Okay, and see that the data, that is the actual data that we expected our API to give us back, the JSON data. Okay, so you can see that when I call fetch, the fetch function itself returns a promise. But when that promise resolves, I get a response object. And then if I call assuming that I expect my response to have a JSON string as the body, I can then call the JSON function on that response object, which will return me another promise, which will resolve to the actual JavaScript object of that data. Okay, so that's essentially how you use it. And again, there's other methods in that response object that allows you to convert into other things like text or blobs or form data objects, depending on what your needs are. Okay, so again, just to kind of walk through the steps of how this fetch thing works. Okay, cool. But you notice like this is like a little messy, not the prettiest thing in the world. So that's where you can use the await syntax. So what I could have done is instead wrap this in a function. So I could say function, get data, because get usually means to go get something. So what I'll do is I'll make this an async function. So you use this async keyword. And then what this does is that's going to let me use the word await instead of just making this fetch. So if I do the same thing, const response, and since I know fetch returns a promise because we just console log it, we saw that fetch returns a promise. Anytime you're using a function that returns a promise, you can just put the word await in front of it. Okay, and if I do that same thing, so if I just literally copy this line, I'll just copy both these lines. Control X. The only difference is I'm going to put the word await in front of fetch. Okay. Okay, and then actually I'm going to just cut the rest of this off too. I'm going to just delete the rest of this. We'll come back to it. And then we'll just immediately call that function, get data. Okay, now watch what happens. Okay, now when I refresh, notice it went straight to the response object. So this time response actually equaled the response object, not the promise. Point being is that what await is doing is then saying, instead of saying, hey, we wait for the promise to resolve. So this actually pauses the function and says, this function will just pause for now. And once that promise resolves, we'll then assign the value of the response, and then we can move forward. Okay, that's essentially what that's doing. So now, and again, assuming that, so now response actually equals a response object. So what if I do this? Const JSON equals await response.json. And then we'll console log JSON. Okay. Let's see what that equals now. Okay, so now if I refresh, and JSON is going to equal the actual data. So async await syntax makes it look a lot cleaner. So like, doesn't this look a lot cleaner than what we were working with before? Okay, I fetch the data, I get back the response object, I take the response object, do a JSON conversion, and then here I have my JavaScript object. Okay, it looks a lot cleaner. So that's the purpose of async await when we're working with promises. But the thing is that the way the fetch works, not only is there a response object that has all these methods, there's also a request object. So instead of actually like just passing a string, and actually even before we do the request object, another thing you can do is that the fetch function can take a second argument, which is an object. Okay? And that object, you can specify different things. You can specify the method. Okay? So let's make another route. So let's go to my server and let's copy this fetch function and make it now fetch2. And this time, we'll make it a post to fetch. So it's a post request. So this is not a get request, because by default, fetch makes a get request. Whenever you use fetch, I didn't have to specify get because that's what fetch does by default. Okay, but now we have a post method or post route. Okay, and just so we know the difference, we'll put goodbye here so that way it has a different response. Okay. Now, so let me go back to the fetch. So what we're going to do here is that we're going to say the method is post. So you can see in this object here, I can customize the request. Okay, and then now I can actually, include headers. Now headers are going to be like key values that tell the server more about your request. So usually the one you'll see a lot is this one called content type, because the way most backend servers know what data you're sending over is through this header. So it'll know, hey, am I parsing this as XML? Am I parsing this as JSON? Am I parsing this as URL encoded data? Am I parsing this as multi-part form data based on this particular header? Okay, so then we'll say like application JSON. That's the one that you would use if you're sending JSON data. So let's actually send some data over. So the data is in the body of the request, okay, which needs to be a JSON string since we told it that we're going to send it as JSON, okay? So what we would do here is we would say you have to use this function called JSON.stringify. That'll take a JavaScript object and turn it into a JSON string because we want to send over a string, not the actual JavaScript object. So we're going to say, request hello. Okay, cool. So notice how I can customize the nature of my fetch. Instead of just doing that simple fetch like I did before, that just went and got something, I can now send stuff over. So let's go back to our back end and let's just show that we actually got that data. So what I'm going to do here in the post, I'm going to console.log rec.body. I also need to make sure that we parse the JSON body. So I'm going to add the JSON middleware over here, app.use express.json. That's going to look for that header and then parse that body. Okay. Again, this is my back end. Now back to the front end. Let's try this out. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit refresh. So you can see we got the response from we expected from our backend. Goodbye. Okay, I can actually see all the details of this in the network column. So if I click here on network, let me just raise this up a little bit. See, I can see the request to that URL, and I can see all the details here. So I can look in headers, see that, hey, look, it made a post request. It was successful, and all the details there. And I can see that, hey, look, it sent over this information. That was the body of the request. Now, again, we console logged the body, if I remember right. Did we console log the body? We'll go back to the back end. Yes, see, we console logged rec.body. So that should show up in my backend console logs, which we see down here. I can see that it did console log successfully, but it should also console log in that window we opened earlier. So let me go open that back up. So if I bring this back over, notice, there it is. Okay, so you see, like, once I set this up, I can also see those console logs in my dev tools. That's pretty neat. So I can see my backend console logs there and my front end console logs here. Okay, so backend, front end, backend, front end. Very, very cool. Okay. Now there's a couple other properties you can pass to fetch, in that second object. So there's also like a property called like credentials. Now what credentials are referring to is if you have any cookies. Okay, so what happens is that you may be using cookies for authentication purposes. So Include would mean include the cookies. So even if you're sending this request to another website than the one you're on, send the cookies over. Okay? Omit means don't include the cookies. Same origin, okay, means only send the cookies if they're coming from the same origin. Okay, so if it's a different URL, and that's the default. So it's going to, if you don't specify this to like include, it's going to default the same origin and won't include your cookies if you have like a backend on a separate URL, which is sometimes often the case for like portfolio projects, because you'll deploy your backend to like Render or Heroku, and then you'll deploy your front end to like Netlify or Vercel. So there's technically two different origins. So if you wanted to use like cookie-based authorization, like to deliver like your JSON cookie in a web cookie, you're going to want to make sure that you do the include on your credentials so it includes the cookie. Okay, so keep that in mind. Okay, so I would like do something like that. I don't need it for this particular purpose since I'm not sending over any cookies, but just so you know, like there's other properties you can specify here on this fetch. Okay, and I think there's a few more. We'll come back to that when we get to the request object. But you can see that this request works. Okay, I can send the request to the server. The server console logged the body that was sent over, hello, and then the front end console log what the server responded with, which was goodbye. Okay, so they're talking to each other. So fetch is the way these two things, our backend and our front end, kind of send messages back and forth. Okay, it always starts off with the front end asking the backend based on a URL, and then the backend based on the URL that was asked for responds. It's kind of like going to a restaurant. There's different things on the menu, and I ask for something on the menu, and then that message gets sent over to the cooks in the back, and then eventually the waiter comes and brings me back what I asked for. Okay, that's literally how your front end and your back end works. So imagine that your front end is the customer, your back end is the kitchen. Okay, and these requests are the messages being back and forth with the waiter. Okay. Now, one last piece is that technically, like I did all this, but technically when I'm doing all of this, what I'm actually doing is creating a request object, which I could just do manually. So I could do this. I could say, const request equals a new request object. So you don't realize it, but you're already doing this. I can create a new request object, okay, which is request info, and I can actually take all of this that I just put here and put it in here. Okay, and this is essentially the same thing. And then what I do is I can take this request object and then pass it to the fetch, and I'll get the same result. Because basically what happens, the fetch is going to use this request object as the details of the instructions that of the request it needs to make. So let's try that out. Let me refresh. Okay, and you see it still works. I still get the same response. Everything works exactly the same as it did before. The only difference is that all the details of the request are now done in a explicitly defined request object. Instead of me passing it to fetch under the hood, creating the request object before it actually does the fetching. Okay, so just realize there's actually three things here. There's the fetch function, which takes a request and makes that request and gives you back a response. Okay, so there's the request object that represents the instructions on the request fetch needs to make. So essentially it's like your order and fetch is a waiter. So basically we're creating our order and giving it to the waiter, and then fetch then brings us back the response object, which represents the thing that we ordered. Okay, and then again, each of these objects have the request and response object have a whole bunch of like methods and stuff in there. And again, for the most part, the request object, you just put in your instructions just like this, and then you pass it to fetch, and then it goes and gets you the things. But I mean, the request and response object are now starting to be used in other avenues. Okay, so for example, what you're starting to see now is in frameworks like Solid Start, Remix, I think even in Quick City. I haven't tried Quick City yet, but they are now using the fetch API, like actually using these objects as the way they handle forms in their framework abstractions. So essentially what would happen is that you would fill out a form using React, let's say React Router 6.4 or above, using Remix, using Solid Start, and other frameworks. You would submit a form, and then what happens is actually on your front end, it creates the request object out of the details of the form and passes the request job the request object to a function you create called a action, and then you would handle the request manually from your front end. So then you would then actually go ahead and make the fetch call, which is an interesting way of doing it. And now thinking about it, you can actually just take that request object and pass it to a fetch if you wanted to. So that is really neat, okay, in how that all works and how that's expanding its use. So that's why it's probably more important now to really understand like the fetch API and like the breadth of the fetch API, because it's being used in more places than just for making, I mean, it's still pretty much being made for HTTP requests, but it's being used more broadly in a more broad set of abstractions. So hopefully you all enjoyed this deep dive into the fetch API, so they really understand it like inside and out. Again, there's many different headers that are standard for a lot of different purposes, such as like authorization headers. If you're doing like doing bearer authorization, so you'd like have a header called authorization, and then usually the body is like the value something like the word bearer space, then like a token or something like that. There's a lot of different headers. You kind of learn them as they come up. But you can see like this is where the headers go. This is where the body goes. You have the credentials. And let's just take a look at what other possible values they have like for the request object. Okay. And then you have, these are all just mostly methods. Yeah. Okay. I think we kind of nailed it. But yeah, so now you can see the full breadth of the fetch API. So my name is Alex Merced from AlexMercedCoder.dev. Make sure you like the video and subscribe. And make sure to follow me on Twitter at twitter.com/AlexMercedCoder. Okay, follow me there. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, and I'll see you all around. Have a great day and enjoy.